Foster, a contemporary Marxist theorist, who discusses the concept of the metabolic rift, that moment in history where the homeostasis between human beings and their natural environment was broken due to capitalist production. So without further ado, I'm going to go over to Tristan to take the floor and give us a little bit of an introduction to the theory before we go on to our reading group discussion. Tristan.
Yeah, Jack, thank you for the introduction. And yeah, the topic of today is Marxist ecology. But the question is like, what is Marxist ecology? To clear that up first. And really, this is the development of ecology through time, viewed from a Marxist standpoint. And what is especially important, especially nowadays, you know, with climate change, is it's important to really know how it came to be that that the whole economy is relying so much on fossil fuels. And like understanding this is super central to actually coming up with a solution that is appropriate for that problem. And really, this is why I believe it's important for everyone to be like informed about that standpoint and to have really the chance to come up with like an adequate solution to that. In Marxist ecology, there's like one concept that is really central, and that is the concept of a concept from Marx. That's the concept of metabolism. And the German translation of that is Stoffwechsel, which really means something like material exchange. And this is like an absolutely central concept for Marxist ecology. So it talks about the metabolism. And the metabolism is really the human relation to nature through labor. And I will start with a quote from Marx that really defines this concept, because it's really central to understand that concept when we move on. Marx defines that concept by saying the following. He says, labor is, first of all, a process between man and nature, a process by which man, through his own actions, mediates, regulates, and controls the metabolism between himself and nature. He confronts the materials of nature as a force of nature. He sets in motion the natural forces which belong to his own body, his arms, leg, head, and hands, in order to appropriate the materials of nature in a form adapted to his own needs. Through this movement, he acts upon external nature and changes it. And in this way, he simultaneously changes his own nature. The labor process is the universal condition for the metabolic interaction, den Stoffwechsel, between man and nature, the everlasting nature-imposed condition of human existence. So we can see already how central it is, because Marx says it's really like an everlasting nature-imposed condition of human existence. And we see also like the materialism of Marx coming through, right? It's like the very condition of our lives, of our human existence. And in this further development of metabolism, there's like one concept, one ecological concept, or like the starting point from an ecological critique that Marx developed, and that is really the concept of the metabolic rift. And you know, obviously, this is like an interruption in that process, right? It's an interruption in the metabolic relation between humans and the earth that undergoes a material estrangement and material alienation, which means the sustainability between humans and the soil is violated. And Marx gives an example that was really like relevant in his time, and that has also to do with the town-country division. So there's like in the beginning of the industrial area, there's really like a change in the way nature has been exploited, and that is like visible in the increase of this town-country division, like more in the urbanization, more people going to, or are being forced rather, to go to the countries. And just to make this clear, like when this happened first, like this is not something that where peasants decided to go to, to go to the towns, but this is rather something that also at its starting point was already something that happened with violence, right? There were like enclosures, there were punitive rent hikes, land clearings, military confiscations. So this really like forced a mass stream of migration to go into the towns. And Marx notes that there is the first ecological imbalance. So I think there should be like a graph that shows really how the towns became increasingly more populous at the beginning of the industrial era. And Marx says that this caused like an ecological imbalance. So in the country side, the soil became infertile more and more because it had to feed all the population in the towns. And at the same time, the towns themselves, they became full of like human manure, waste that could not be transported away that quickly. Like the river of the Thames was like really polluted. And here is the point where Marx noted that this is the first occurrence of a metabolic rift. And actually, this is something that Bellamy Foster really highlights in his book. I think you should see it on the screen now. What he highlights is that this problem has been actually quite serious. So Britain had to, like at this time, had to artificially fertilize the soil through, for example, guano imports, through what I found especially shocking in some way, or like unexpected, also through bone imports from the Napoleonic battlefields. And in fact, Britain also had to really import vast amounts of Irish soil. So in some way, it was already visible that the British agricultural practice at this time was not sustainable, right? The soil was really exploited, and in order to make up for that imbalance, they had to already like take part in some form of like colonial practice, or like basically stealing the soil from other countries. And in our time, we see this metabolic rift, this ecological imbalance, especially in climate change, right? In this like enormous concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere. And the reason for that is that we are relying so much on fossil fuel energy. And I want to really go back to that time where we adapted fossil fuel energy. At that time, it was coal, right, as an energy source over other energy sources that we now know as sustainable energy sources. Because really, at that time, there were like two competing sources of energy. One source of energy was the energy source of of coal, like fossil energy, right? And the other ones were sustainable energy sources like water power, wind, etc. And these, in the research of Malm, he names them the energy of the flow, like water, right, like streams of rivers, etc. Wind. This is all like energy of the flow. And then there's the energy of the stock. So the stock is like fixed in space, subterranean, and it's basically a reservoir of energy, right? Of like, it's like a condensed energy over like millions of years. And I want to really go to answer the question of like, why was steam? So like the steam engine was the engine that used actually coal as energy, adapted over the energy of the flow. And to give the answer shortly, the reason why it was adapted is actually because of capitalist property relations. But you know, if you look at the most common answers that are there for that, then you really will encounter often the so-called Ricardian Malthusian paradigm. So the Ricardian Malthusian paradigm, I try to really keep it short. The Ricardian Malthusian paradigm is that land only has a limited amount of energy. And Malthus is, so that's what Ricardo says. And Malthus is saying that population grows geometrically, whereas plant growth is only arithmetically. So that means the growth geometrically is exponentially, and the growth arithmetically is only linear. So that means after a while, our food resources will not be able to keep up with our population growth. This is still, by the way, a theory that is like very popular today, and you can see it in that movie from Michael Moore, that this is like still a theory alive and well, even though it's like the implications of it are actually really horrible. However, these two things together make up the Ricardian Malthusian paradigm. After a while, there will be like a scarcity of energy because of too much population growth, and we reach like a bottleneck, right, where we have too much population and too limited energy. And the reason why coal was adapted, according to this paradigm, is that coal shattered a bottleneck. It shattered this bottleneck of energy. That's why we could suddenly, that basically entangled this paradigm. However, if we look at the facts, then we see that flow actually, so the energy of the flow, like rivers, could actually provide with energy in abundance, and this energy was also quite cheap, and it could also provide the same amount of energies. So actually, this kind of like refutes this Ricardian Malthusian paradigm. Also, by the way, just one more word to this paradigm is that now that we see people are saying a problem of climate change, for example, is that there's like too much of a population, but we see that we can actually, or that there would be like a food scarcity, but actually the amount of food we have is really like 2 times as much as needed for like feeding the whole population, just like as a little side fact. But anyway, we see that like the energy of the flow was so the energy of the coal was adapted in comparison with the energy of the flow. So why was this adapted? And the answer to that is that steam arose as a form of power exercised by some people against others. And I will go into this into more detail. So this has like a spatial dimension and it has a temporal dimension, right? So the first spatial dimension of flow, why it was like more appropriate for capitalists to adapt the energy of the stock, is that the energy of the flow could not be appropriated, right? It's like it flows, it cannot be used as a property. The use of the flow is by nature, by its very characteristic, communal, right? People have to share it, people have to cooperate. A mill owner upstream needs to cooperate with the mill owner downstream so that they both get the same amount of energy from the flow. However, if we look at capitalist property relations, then we see that the law of these property relations is the law of competition. And if we are within the law of competition, then we will always follow a zero-sum logic. That means the win, the extra profit of some person is the extra loss for the other person. And this dynamic really makes cooperation difficult. And the second dimension is the spatial dimension. The second spatial dimension is that energy of the flow is centrifugal. So that means the right river sites to place your mill, right, as like an owner of capital, they are not necessarily located where cities are. They are, so just to be clear, Britain had enough good spots for like, for building up mills, but the problem was that they were dispersed over the country. So there's like a centrifugal dynamic, a centrifugal spatial dynamic of the flow that basically forces capital owners who want to invest into the energy of the flow to build their mills at places that are like far away from cities. And that's actually very important because the first problem with that is that the procurement of labor is just much more difficult in regions where there are like less people, right? So you have to seduce people or to tempt people to come from far away to labor for you in these mills. And that means you have to really build up actually the towns basically yourself. You have to build up the houses, the chapel. You have to create the right conditions for the workers to be, to be convinced to come to your workplace there.
So een lied al gevonden van die derde lama.
Sorry.
Oh.
Sorry. So you have to really tempt the people to come to the to that specific mill, and that also creates the problem but the conditions that the capital owners really develop like personal relations with their workers, and at the same time they are more vulnerable to labor power, which means that if there's a strike, if people decide to leave that place, then then you cannot replace them that easily. And in comparison, steam is centrally located in the city. Labor is easy to procure because there is already like a big surplus population, right? There's an industrial reserve army, free workers for you that allow you to really press down on the wages. So to sum it up, you really have to bring the power to the people. You bring the power to the people with coal, whereas you have to bring the people to the power with regard to the energy of the flow. And the relation that the capital owners have with the workers is a rather impersonal a relation where they see them as objectified commodity. And the second dimension, I will just go briefly to that second dimension, is the temporal dimension. So the nature of the flow is a nature of fluctuation, right? So so sometimes the flow is very strong. So you would have to work, for example, 14 hours consistently to really take advantage of the energy of the flow. And other days it's just strong for, like, for example, 6 hours. So the amount of work the workers have to put in varies, and that means you can only exploit them in reference to absolute time. And this dynamic becomes even stronger once labor power gained traction in Britain and had introduced the Factory Act and a 10 hours workday. And here you see at the same time that that the dynamic of the energy of the stock is way more suitable for that, because really if you just have like a limited amount of work time, for example 10 hours, then you can only squeeze out these 10 hours. That means you have to really take out the max in these 10 hours that you have. In coal, for steam engines, this is possible because they are not vulnerable to any fluctuations, right? You can just take perfectly these 10 hours for the work time and use them fully. And this is also what Marx said. That Marx said, capital threw itself with all its might and in full awareness of the situation into the production of relative surplus value. So relative surplus value in the sense that the day was limited and you had to really intensify the production in this limited amount of time, and only coal was suitable for that. So really, to sum up, coal was used as the primary energy source due to the capitalist property relations. So, and this is also in some way what really increased this country-town division, what we were like talking about in the beginning. And so for the next part, I really want to show how the adaptation of coal as like a basic pillar of capitalist production became embedded in that production. So for this, I will go through this process, or I will show what it means that coal was adapted in this process in detail through some formulas. They might look scary at the beginning, but I will try to just lead you through it as comprehensively as I can. So we should like see now the general formula of capital. In one part, you should see the worker, and the other part, you should see the capitalist. And there, you see that there's a split, right? Like there's an inversion in this relation.
Sorry to interrupt, but we can't see your screen.
Sorry?
We can't see your screen. Sorry to interrupt.
You can't see my screen?
No.
I sorry, like these visuals, they should be visible to all those who watch on Facebook and on YouTube.
Oh, okay. Yes.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
No worries.
But I can just say it. So what's really important is with regard to this formula is the split in the means of production, right? Some people own the means of production and some don't, right? Some have to just sell their labor power on the market, whereas others own the means of production. But at the end, these means of productions have to be they have between these two parties, they have to be put together. Here this whole metabolism comes to the fore again, right? Because the metabolism with nature, right, through the means of production, so through our tools that we have that make up the inorganic body of humans, through that the metabolism is organized. And I want to go now to these two formulas. So the first formula that we see is CMC. And I'm sure you already know what it means. So the worker has to, goes into the market with his labor power. He has to sell his labor power in order to gain money. And with this money, he buys another product. This is the C at the end. So this is the first formula. However, the capitalist advances in a different way to that. So he advances his capital, his money, in order to make a profit. This is the whole goal of it. And this is what we also see, like we see this formula. These formulas have like really important differences, right? For the first formula is like a qualitative one, right? You want to buy something for its use value, whereas the second one exists for the quantity, right? There's no different quality of money. Quality, the only thing you want is like an increase in the quantity of the money, an increase in the exchange value. And we see, like in the third formula, with the one about production, we see that now what happens actually in the process of production is that commodities in the form of labor power in means of production are put to work in production, and they produce then another commodity, and this commodity is then sold right on the market for more money for the capitalist. But what's really crucial about this is that this formula is really like a cycle that continues, that expands each time, because it doesn't end at M apostrophe. Britain also had to really import a vast amount. Oh, now I hear myself. Okay, now I don't hear myself anymore. So it doesn't end with M apostrophe. M apostrophe is just a new start of a new cycle where production is expanded. And what this means really within this productive process, it always includes a material throughput. That is what Marx says about it. This material throughput is a necessary condition of capital. So if this cycle continues, we really have like an expansion of the material throughput. And where does that at the end to profit come from? Marx's answer of that, of course, is clear. It comes from labor power. So it's a use value in generating fresh exchange value. That is what he saw as labor power. So it's basically the surplus of time that the laborer doesn't need for spending on his means of subsistence. This is the amount of profit that is taken from the laborer, right? Just to sum up, so these capitalist property relations, they cause first the profit motive, second the compulsion to chase this profit motive for the capitalist, and the necessity of a growing material throughput. And now what Marx wants us to really think about this is that he wants us really to defamiliarize us with this concept of growth. He wants us to understand that this is really a historically unique situation, and that this is not something that's written in stone or that has to be forever. And now we come actually to the part that Malm is adding, that the research of Malm is adding to that formula from Marx. And that is really that within that formula of capital, fossil fuels now have to be included. So the fossil fuels become utilized across a spectrum of commodity production. And that means that within the means of production, fossil fuel becomes one component. And we see, for example, that in the production process, right, fossil fuel is combusted. And that means we have an increase of CO2. That means the material throughput that we have that expands with every cycle in this form of production, in this mode of production, becomes ever more, because fossil fuels become such a central part in the capitalist economy. All right, they are like the main provider of energy. And in graph 5 and in formula 5 and 6, we see how fossil fuel becomes part of the private consumption and how fossil fuels become part of the primitive accumulation of capital. It's not really, like, the details of these are really not that important, of 5 and 6. What's just important to understand about it is that there's like a capitalist whose sole purpose is to to generate or to bring the fossil fuels out of the earth. And the private consumption is the person who really sells his labor power, gains money, and buys something like, for example, a car with it, which also like is dependent on fossil fuel consumption. And in the last part of it, we see like all these formulas together. They all look a bit complicated, but for example, if we look at the first part, which is the primitive accumulation of fossil capital, this is like the generation of the fossil capital. It is used in the second formula in the means of production, and it is used in the third formula, right, in the private consumption. And it is also so it really, this graph really, it looks a bit complicated, but it's really just there to show how much fossil fuels have become part of a capitalist economy, and how through the dynamic of a capitalist economy they are really forced to like expand, to become ever more. And you know, at the end of this presentation, I really want to say that any critique of or like any Marxist ecologist critique really starts from this point at the end, because we have to like understand that the capitalist mode of production, by its very nature, will increase the material throughput. So in this case, will increase the amount of fossil fuels that are combusted. It will always tend to grow. And that means that all kinds of like solutions that we you know, that we want to propose that do not tackle, you know, this specific dynamic are really forced to fail. And this is the case, for example, for all these you know, for all these for example, if you look at the European emission trading market about climate change, you know, it's like really trying to stop climate change through the dynamic that kind of causes climate change to happen in the first place. It really doesn't tackle this fundamental dynamic of production. So really, these models that are based on market fundamentalism are really not enough. They're not sufficient. We really need to change these kind of property relations and the very mode of production of capitalism. If we don't do that, we will really be stuck in this endless growth dilemma, which, you know, at the end, ultimately, our planet will not be able to support this, right? There's just a limit, and we cannot cross that limit, but we are like crossing it really, unfortunately, every day. And it's really important to understand that it is really centrally at this point, right, in this mode of production, where most of the fossil fuel is combusted in these big industries, right? It's really not the private consumer of it. And this is like also one of the you know, these central tendencies that we find nowadays. These are like these individualized approaches, right? Change your lifestyle like this, change your lifestyle like that, just consume less of this and this, and this is your only way you can contribute to that. But we, as like socialists, we actually believe that like climate change is a collective problem that we need to also tackle collectively. That means we need to democratize our production, and we need to have like a plan and a rational response to the problem of climate change. And I also believe that at the end, this is really something that Marx wanted to, you know, it wanted to show us clearly. Marx wanted to highlight and make us aware of the fact that this is something that's like really temporary. And yeah, for ending that presentation, I will end with a quote of Marx. Marx said to that a solution to the metabolic rift, and what we want, like Marx's solution wanted that, and I quote, socialized man, the associated producers, govern the human metabolism with nature in a rational way, bringing it under their own collective control instead of being dominated by blind power. And I also believe that this really hints at the solution we need to have for climate change. Yeah, thank you for your attention in that presentation, and I hope I could bring you some insights, and I will give back the word to Jack.
Thank you very much, Tristan. That was a very enjoyable presentation. I'm sure we've all learned a lot from you. I know I have. Before we move on to the discussion of the text that we read alongside Tristan's Tristan's own presentation, I want to tell you a little bit about the events that we have coming up over the following weekend. Tomorrow, we have a meeting about the right to self-determination, in particular with regard to women and the right to make their own choices over their own bodies, which has been under threat lately, particularly within the right wing and the narratives in this political domain. And following that, on Saturday, we are joined by Talat Ahmed from SWP in Scotland, as well as Ajit Abhyankar, who is from the Communist Party in India, and they're going to talk about the current situation in India and the right-wing government there and the reaction to the current crisis. So that'll be a really interesting one. And then following that on Sunday, we have another reading group, which is at 1 o'clock, and it is on Marxism and the intersections of race and class. So in particular today, I think we'll all realize that that's very relevant given the recent uprising on the Black Lives Matter movement. And so if you've been following that, then this is a really awesome reading group for you to join. So if you want to join for any of these meetings, you can check that out on our Facebook page and sign up in particular for the reading group. And finally, before I leave you all, we've just had our newspaper come out a couple of days ago. And if you want to access this, you can do so for free. Just check out our Facebook page and or our website, which will give you a link to the free download of this newspaper. So again, thank you very much, Tristan, for your discussion and your talk. And until next time, everyone. All right, I assume we're no longer being recorded.
I can see you.